And I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. Okay, so what we're going to talk a little bit about is if you happen to be in a room or if you have 2 monitors yourself, how can you use them productively? And one of the things that inspired me, 2 things is there's 2 reasons why I'm doing this. One is I happen to be teaching in 2 rooms where there are 2 monitors, and someone came in before me in the room. In one case, they set it so that the 2 monitors are just mirror images of each other. So you have one monitor on top of the podium and another one right in the podium that have identical displays, which is not perhaps the most efficient way of using 2 monitors. You don't need to see the same material in 2 places or identical material in 2 places. The other is in another classroom where whoever was teaching before me would take the second monitor, which was on the corner of the podium, and they would turn it so that you couldn't really actually see it very well. I think they also used to cover up the camera on the web camera. I think they were concerned that somehow they were being recorded or something, which was not likely to be the case. But in any case, I used 2 monitors a few times whenever I went to conferences. Many campuses have 2 monitors on all their classrooms and so forth. And I've been encouraging us to move in that direction for about 7 or 8 years now. But I picked up my own second monitor at the start of the pandemic when we were on Zoom, because it was just really challenging to run Zoom effectively along with other software while trying to manage a large class. So I just want to talk a little bit about some ways you can do it. Oh, the other reason I thought it might be good to do this is because we have 2 monitors in we have the monitor and the projected screen in the CELT office here. And whenever someone comes in and does a presentation, they often get a little bit confused in terms of what goes on which screen. So those are basically the things I wanted to talk about. So basically, the advantages of a second monitor is that you can follow some information on one screen without sharing that with the group you're presenting to or with your people on Zoom. So if you're in a classroom, for example, and you're sharing the class through Zoom as well as with students in the classroom, what happens basically is there may be things you want to see or you want to monitor without it interfering with the material that you're presenting. If you're using slides or some software package or some type of thing you're presenting on the screen, you don't want that screen cluttered up with other stuff that's just going to get in the way of the presentation. And among the things people often use with a second monitor is if they're using some sort of back channel discussion, or if you're in Zoom, the chat window can go on the second screen. So it's not covering the material that's being presented, but it's visible to you as the instructor. If you're doing polling, for example, with iClicker, having that second monitor is pretty much essential if you want to see the results as they're coming in without sharing those results with students. Back when we were using physical clickers, there was a separate device that would keep track of the results. But in most classrooms now, we don't have those devices. So if you're doing polling and you want to know how people are responding as a first stage of a polling process so that you can get the results and then decide what to do with them, you're kind of out of luck unless you bring a second laptop or you bring a mobile device that you can monitor the polls on. But if you have a second monitor, you can get a copy of the results so you can see in real time what answers people are picking. And if you find that everyone's getting the questions correctly, or nearly everyone, you don't have to spend a lot of time on that topic. If you find that nearly everyone's getting it wrong, then you may want to backtrack a little bit and build up to that type of question. But if you find, for example, that there's a good mix of people getting it correct and incorrect with questions where there are correct and incorrect answers, you might then use, and this is the encouraged practice, which results in the most learning, you might want to have students discuss the answers with themselves or amongst themselves, and then vote again after they've had that peer-to-peer discussion. So with the second monitor, you know exactly what the results are, but you don't share them with students, because having them discuss the results after they know how people have voted is not a very productive way of engaging in that discussion. So it's really essential. And another thing that I experienced when I was back in the classroom and I lost my second monitor was that if I had students who were remote because they were sick or ill or out of state or some other reason, they couldn't be there in person, sometimes they'd send me a direct message in class. And if you only have one monitor, that display is going up on the screen. And even if you mute the screen, if you're recording the class for people who couldn't be there synchronously, it's going to be recorded in that recording, and then you'd have to edit it out. So having a second monitor where you keep track of messages coming in is really, really convenient. So that's one set of reasons for doing it. The other is that quite often you're presenting from more than one source. You might have Google Slides, you might have PowerPoint, but you also might want to demonstrate something within Brightspace, for example, and show that to your class. Or you might want to open up a document or a website, or you may want to call up some software. For example, when I'm teaching econometrics, I keep an econometric software package on screen. And by having that second monitor, you can have all the materials that you want to share at some point during your class staged and ready to bring them on the screen to share with the students in the class or with the students that are remote. So basically, it allows you to have a much more efficient presentation where you're not fumbling around and trying to go back and forth between different resources. I was in a classroom about an hour and a half ago where I was fumbling a lot because I was stuck with this one monitor and I hadn't had enough time to load everything in advance. And it just is not very efficient if you have to fumble around and not have the materials ready when you'd like to display them. And one of the things that students often complain about is that faculty do not appear to be prepared for class, and they have to struggle sometimes to call up material that they like to have. With the second monitor, as long as you arrive in class early enough, you can get everything staged there and then share the one clear screen that only contains the material you're presenting at the time, and then just bring other things to it. So that's really helpful. Another reason is if you do use slide notes, or if you're doing a formal presentation and you have a fixed amount of time, you could add timings to the slide notes to put guidelines on how much time you should spend on each topic, or you could even put a timer up. That's probably most important if you're doing one of those I forgot the name of them. At CIT, they're called Ignite presentations, but those short presentations where you have a fixed number of slides and a certain number of minutes to present some concept. Having the timer there makes it easier to keep track, and so you don't talk more than you should be. And that can be helpful. And a lot of people will have notes where the slides are presenting contain more imagery, but not so much text, which is generally a good practice. But you may want to have some notes to remind you of things you want to cover. And that you could keep on the screen that only you could see, that's not visible by the people who are in the classroom or on Zoom. So basically, the goal is that the shared monitor, in the classroom I'm in right now, the shared monitor is on the wall here, and that contains just what you're seeing on the screen. But I have other materials. I got a Chrome window open here. I have a chat window for Zoom open. All my Zoom controls are on the other screen. Now, I'd share that, except you wouldn't see the Zoom controls. But one of the issues, if you've tried using a single monitor with Zoom, is you've got that little taskbar with all those controls for breakout rooms, for stopping and stopping sharing, and for recording and so forth. That's either floating at the top or floating at the bottom, and it will often cover the materials that you want to present. By keeping that control on the other screen, you're not covering anything that you need to access on the main screen. And that, again, is really beneficial in practice. And the monitor that only you can see, again, this duplicates a little bit of what we talked about, but chat, your direct messages, perhaps a list of participants. If you're in Zoom and you're sharing a slide presentation, for example, one of the nice things that happens is you can put up all the students or the remote participants on the screen. So if they have questions, if they raise their hands and so forth, you can see that immediately without it cluttering up other material. And anything that you're going to be displaying at some point during a presentation can be stored on the second one. We've talked about all of those. And I mentioned the iClicker polls. Having that participant window is really helpful on the second one. And this, yeah, I've already mentioned all of these things, but keeping these things on the second screen is really useful. And the screen that you're sharing with people in the room or remotely should only contain the things that you want the remote participants to see. And you don't want to be covering that with all the extra materials that Zoom or other software will put up there. And that's just about, oh, and when you record it, you only record typically if you're recording it for people to view later. And as we do with nearly all the workshops we're doing are recorded, and most other workshops are recorded. We're only recording the projected display, only the screen that's being shared with other people. So that's pretty much it. And you know, if you do this a few times, you get really proficient at it, and it allows for a much more efficient presentation and much less fumbling on your part. I did have a little issue here when I was sitting on the other side of this table because the shared screen was to my left, but in order to drag things to it, I had to drag it to the right, which just created a little bit of cognitive dissonance because it just wasn't quite as intuitive. So I moved the screen, the computer that we do the presentations from, to this side, and then it's a very natural motion to drag things from the screen in front of you over to the screen you're presenting on the right. And so it just gives us a lot more options, and it allows us to communicate more effectively with our students, and it allows us to use polling software in the way that evidence shows is most effective. So that's pretty much all I have. So any questions, comments? Okay, well, I'll stop the presentation. If you have any questions at any point, let me know, and I'm happy. I'll get back to you as quickly as I can.